Hello, welcome to the Style Masterclass Podcast. I am Miss J, your host, Master Certified Life Coach, and personal stylist, style coach. Today we are going to talk about taking up space. Now, I've done episodes in the past about taking up space. This was in a holiday episode in the past. I also mentioned it in our beach series that we did in the past. This time I want to talk about this in a little more of a nuanced way. There's taking up physical space, which I think is super important to know you are allowed to do. But there's also taking up sort of emotional space, space with your presence, with your very voice. And I think this nuance is super important to talk about. And then I'm going to show you how it relates to style. So let's talk about taking up physical space. If you are in a larger sized body, this is going to be something that you are very familiar with. I recently got on an airplane. I was going to Orlando, and I only fly first class now. And not because I'm bad and bougie, a little bit, but because it became physically uncomfortable to the degree that I had bruises on my hips, parts of my thigh, last time I flew non-first class. I was actually in business class, which is supposed to have more room. And I remember the gentleman sitting next to me. He had no problem taking up all the space. He was not a small person, but smaller than me, technically. Taller, but otherwise smaller than me. And he thought it was perfectly okay to spread his legs wide, to clamp down the armrest so forcefully that he actually bruised my hip and part of my thigh. He had no qualms about taking up the space. Well, even space that wasn't his to take, he felt perfectly fine taking it up. And the entire flight, I remember feeling shame. And I remember trying to shrink myself as if that's possible. And, leaning against the wall, trying to tuck my hip in, trying to literally try and make myself smaller. Now, I know so many of you have experienced this in some form or fashion. Maybe you're too tall, quote unquote, so you're afraid to take up the space with your height and you make self deprecating jokes about how tall you are. Maybe you're living in a larger body, so you make self deprecating jokes about the size of your body. Or there's a particular part of your body that you feel just taking up a little too much space. It's a little too large. Breasts, booty, hips, lips, eyes, fill in the blank. Even your nose, the size of your head. I have heard it all as a style coach. I want to normalize this for you. We all have a body part that we kind of think some things about. And it's not limited to just the overall size of your body. It could be a particular part of it. That somehow there's a moral value in it being smaller, or you being shorter, or flatter, or smoother, or less nasal, or smaller lips, or fill in the blank. And what I want to let you know is it's utter nonsense. You're not alone in thinking this, but it's actually not the truth. You aren't too tall, or too fat, or too large, or too big lipped, or too googly eyed, or whatever it is that you're thinking about. Now, that's not to diminish your experience, because we live in certain cultures and certain places where it's considered normal or better to be smaller or have smaller insert body part. But that doesn't make it so. It doesn't make it truth. And it doesn't mean that it's a rule you have to continue to believe or live by. How do we know it's not truth? Well, depending on the decade you're in, there's a celebration of particular body parts as large, too large, small, not small enough, and it changes from decade to decade. The relationship with the breast has been a fascinating one through the centuries. Up, down, small, globular, whatever it is. That's how we know the present day adages that your breast should look a particular way, your nose or your lips or your hips or your booty. We know it's not truth because in the next decade, it could change. If it was true, it'd be true for all time. And that's certainly not the case with modes and fashion trends around body parts. So it's not true that it's too big or that you're too big. And if we start with that fundamental part, if we start with that sentence in our mind and we start to reprogram whatever we've learned, then we can get to a place where if it's not true that this part is quote unquote too big, then maybe, just maybe, I'm allowed to take up a little more space. I'm allowed to take the armrest. I get half of it. It's mine. I'm allowed to be the height that I am. I'm allowed to have the sized booty that I have. My breasts are the size that they are. My nose, my eyes, they're the size that they are. They're human body parts. And that's how you start to reprogram your brain that there's something wrong. Nothing's gone wrong, my friend. You have some human body parts, and maybe you live in a decade in time where that's considered not so great. Doesn't make it true. So that's the physical space component. You are allowed to take up space. Your nose is allowed to be wide. Your eyes are allowed to be big. Whatever the case is, you're allowed to have the body part that you have, and it's allowed to take up space. The mass that it is not a problem until you think it is. Recognizing that there's going to be people who have thoughts. They're entitled to them. Doesn't make it true. Now, in terms of your voice or your presence, this is also something I was thinking about on my recent trip. I sometimes will go into large gatherings of people and be myself, irreverent, cracking jokes, being loud, laughing, dancing, cackling, sometimes snort laughing. And I have a fairly large presence. Now, that's not an actual objective criteria. That's just something we say. I have a large presence. And inevitably what happens for me, and a lot of extroverts might experience this as well, is the inevitable regret and remorse over something you've said. And then cue the over-rumination, as if you could unsay it by thinking a lot about it. And what I realized during this week away with friends who are my friends is that I'm also allowed to take up space with my voice. I'm also allowed to take up space with the energy I bring into a room. And how do I know that I'm allowed to? Because I do. Now, I could try to quelch that part of myself. In fact, for the first 2 days that I was at this retreat in this place with my friends, I did try to quelch my voice and to be smaller and to not bring so much energy into the room. But guess what? It snuck out anyway. And my friends noticed that I was being kind of weird, and they called me out on it, and God bless my friends. But really, it's not like I could maintain that for a long period of time without feeling absolutely miserable. And by day 2, I was pretty miserable. Locked in my room alone, crying to my husband that I wanted to go home. And not because anyone had done anything or said anything, but I thought that by quelching my voice, literally, and the energy that I was bringing, that I could somehow make everyone a little more comfortable around me. The opposite turned out to be true, but even if the opposite hadn't turned out to be true for others, I couldn't have maintained that quelching of my own voice and my energy for long. It was such an expenditure of energy that I kind of felt burnt out even after 2 days. So why am I allowed to take up space with my voice and my energy? Because it's not literally something I could help. And it's not something I want to change. So your Glam Gal mission, should you choose to accept it this week, is to notice where you're trying to physically shrink. Notice where you're trying to emotionally shrink, where you're trying to squelch your energy, your fire, your voice, your opinions, your thoughts. It's a futile exercise, my darling. You will be burnt out and exhausted in the attempt. So if you needed a permission slip, here it is. You are absolutely allowed to take up space with your body, with your voice, and with your energy. If you want to learn more about how to work with me and how I help women own every room they walk into and build confident legacies, then come join me in Style Masterclass. You can go to judithgaton.com/style-school. Until next time, my friends, Miss J out.